This year has been unlike any other. During our emergency response to COVID-19, we adapted everything we did to continue supporting those facing the causes and consequences of homelessness. With our 50-year history, we were well placed to do so. In the past year alone, we've supported over 10,000 people through a wide range of services, from families struggling with relationship breakdown to those experiencing street homelessness and housing insecurity. Our teams have benefited from the time, wisdom and expertise of 995 volunteers, each contributing to our vision of a more inclusive society.
So we're here with Mike Wright. Mike works for Cyrenians, which is a charity that's based in Edinburgh and does a lot of work around Scotland with homeless people and helping support different needs and stuff. So Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
And Mike, we've got some questions from our S1s this year who've been doing a unit on homelessness. We've recently watched a documentary film, Evicted, and kind of explored the lives of some families and their experiences of homelessness. But that was really based down in England, and we want to just grapple with some of these questions, particularly in the context of Scotland. And I guess the first question, Mike, that came out from our S1s having watched that film was really, what are the causes of homelessness that people experience? What situations have people been in that have led to homelessness?
Okay. The two biggest drivers that we find time and again are poverty and childhood trauma, so where people have had difficult experiences growing up, and that has impacted on their ability to make and sustain relationships, or to ask for help, to make use of support, and those kind of things. There are also some contextual factors in a city like Edinburgh, for example, which has under normal circumstances quite a large number of visitors come in any given year. So we have quite a lot of pressure on our accommodation in terms of visitors, in terms of students. We have quite a thriving Airbnb or second home rental market. And compared to most cities in Scotland, we actually have a very low stock of social housing. So this creates a bit of a bottleneck in our housing system. That means that people have to wait for quite a long time until they can access a home of their own, and in some cases even to be able to access the sort of emergency accommodation that prevents you from having to sleep rough, sleep in the streets, graveyards, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I guess, how much, Mike, perhaps does some social problems like drug and alcohol addiction play a part in people's situations that lead up to homelessness?
It's definitely a feature. It can be both a cause and a consequence of homelessness, actually, the drug and alcohol use. So for people who have perhaps had those traumatic experiences, drugs and alcohol can often be used as a way to cope with the difficulties they're experiencing. And equally, when people newly become homeless, they find it quite difficult to have the base that we're also accustomed to in a home, that the safe place that we can return to each night, where we can truly be ourselves. To have that removed, some people, their way of coping with that is through the use of alcohol and drugs.
Yeah, of course, we saw some of that in the documentary we watched, Mike, in terms of how the situation of uncertainty and anxiety that builds up within homelessness situations cause an awful lot of mental health problems in different ways that maybe lead on to addictions of different types. We're aware of that. Grand. So I guess, Mike, just our pupils were quite interested in the experiences of those families we watched in the documentary, and really what the experience must be for people who have this kind of uncertainty of never knowing where they're going to lay their heads. Just simple things like what do they eat, and do they have access to mobile phones, and is there much of a homeless community? Do they have many friends around them and supporters around them in different ways?
So obviously the last year to 14 months has been a little bit different, but historically Edinburgh is actually very well served for places that people can eat for free or extremely cheaply. I would say during the week there are around about 30 different venues that are offering either communal meals or takeaway foods. On top of that, there are a number of provisions where people can have access to sort of emergency food parcels. A number of the big supermarket chains, for example, work with ourselves and an organisation called Fair Share to redistribute food that's coming towards the end of its shelf life. And that can be used in some of these venues that I've talked about, or potentially given directly to people. However, over the last year to 14 months, that kind of communal space hasn't really been possible, as we all know through the experiences it's had in our own lives. So we've had to do a great amount of work as a sector to, I suppose, to individually provide food for people and to deliver it quite often to people's homes, because they've been shielding or they've been perhaps trying to avoid transmission, infection, that kind of thing. In terms of mobile phones, that's actually, it's quite a difficult issue for people who are experiencing homelessness. As you can imagine, it's quite difficult to charge a phone, for example, if you don't have access to power points. There are a number of voluntary sector organisations who provide drop-in facilities, and people will be able to charge phones, etc. there. There are also some of the bus stops in the centre of Edinburgh that allow you to put a little bit of charge into your phone. But increasingly we find the world is becoming more digital. So things like applications for housing and welfare benefits claims, people are increasingly asking you to make those online. Now, there are probably a couple of issues there. Not everyone knows how to use that type of equipment or those resources. And as you mentioned, not everyone has access to the equipment to do so. One of the things that worked very well during the lockdown period, the pandemic, was the Connecting Scotland Fund, which enabled people who wouldn't otherwise have been able to have access to smartphones, to have access to tablets, and in some case, things like Chromebooks, which I suppose were important for enabling people to stay in contact with friends and family. Now, there are lots of reasons why people lose some of their social networks, their friends and family, when they fall homeless. It can be down to things such as not having an address and it being difficult to correspond. Or if you are doing things like staying with a friend, different friends, different nights here and there, it's quite difficult to say where you're going to be at any given time. But we have worked really hard to try and ensure that people have access to these types of devices so that they can, I guess they can have stronger social networks, because we think that's quite important to helping people to move away from homelessness. Another factor can be that there is a bit of stigma attached to being homeless, and some people don't want their friends or family to know that they're going through a tough time and hope that they can resolve it quickly and then resume contact once they've moved away from their homelessness experience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. You mentioned that this year's been very different, obviously, because of the pandemic, and perhaps that's led to greater social isolation for many people experiencing these things. I guess the government stepped in many different ways, perhaps with new policies and things like that. But is there ways in which the government could do more to address the problems? Do you find that the government and services are supportive of the work and meeting the needs? What do you think could be done, perhaps, in our country to address the issue of homelessness?
Well, I mean, as you say, it's been very interesting over the last year or so. Probably noticed that in most of the major cities in Scotland that there's been very little evidence of rough sleeping. I'm not saying it's completely eradicated, but the numbers appear to have dramatically dropped. So when there's a political will, then it appears that it is possible to end rough sleeping, the sort of the harshest form of homelessness. We've done that this year through a combination of spot purchase of hotel spaces and temporary flats and that kind of thing. But one of the biggest issues is actually number of houses that we have available. There is a real chronic shortage of houses. There's a number of factors that have gone into that. things like selling off of social housing to individuals without replacing that stock has meant that there's a sort of a dwindling stock available at the same time as the general population is growing, living longer, etc. All these factors that put more pressure on our sort of social infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And we noticed that in the film that there's actually so much need. The numbers were for the kind of need for housing down south were in the hundreds of thousands, but there were many homes that were lying empty. So it's almost like the housing is not appropriate for the needs that are being met.
So there are around about 3,000 people who are homeless any given night in Edinburgh, and of those, there's about 60 to 100 maximum that would be sleeping on the streets. That's under normal conditions when we're not within the pandemic and accommodating everyone. The rest of the people are staying in different locations, such as with friends, what we call sofa surfing, where you don't have a proper room of your own, but perhaps you're sleeping a couple of nights on someone's couch and then perhaps a few nights somewhere else. Things like hostels, bed and breakfast, temporary flats, etc. And the wait that people have in order to access permanent housing of their own in Edinburgh is around about 18 to 24 months. So quite a long time you have to maintain that temporary position. And for some people who have a greater complexity of need, let's say, the idea of trying to sustain a placement where there is no support, where there's no tolerance of alcohol and drugs, it's almost unrealistic, and people fall out of that system, end up back on the streets, and they have to go back to the beginning again.
So certainly more could be done to reduce that waiting time. That's a key aspect. I guess, Mike, how if we were looking to help, I guess certainly we've been thinking in our class in Dunbar, how can we address this problem as S1 pupils? How would we maybe help address this problem? And particularly, Mike, as you work for Cyrenians, a charity in Scotland, what do Cyrenians do in support of homeless people in addressing this problem in our nation?
My team has a number of different projects. One that we have, we go out onto the streets. It's called the Homeless Navigator Project. We have a team of 2 that go out onto the streets every day, and they go to places where people spend time who are on the streets. So they go to begging pitches, or they go to car parks, or graveyards, or public parks, places where we know that people sleep rough. And we take time to try and build up a relationship with people and try and understand what's happened in their lives that's caused them to be in this position. And we can accompany them to try and access emergency housing and advocate for their right to be inside. Because of the problem I said earlier around about the lack of facilities and temporary accommodation, we would try and stick with people until they had a sort of a permanent home of their own. And the reason really behind that is that I guess that it means that you have one continuous person in your life who's caring for you, rather than being passed from person to person as you journey through the homelessness system in Scotland. That team that I mentioned is actually in part staffed by people who've been homeless themselves. So the project is not only helping people who are currently homeless, but also, I guess, giving a job opportunity to someone who's come from that background. And we actually find that people on the streets find it hugely inspiring to speak to someone who's been through the same types of challenges, and who can maybe tell them, this is a good person to speak to, or this service wasn't so good for me, I might steer away from that one. So we found that's a quick way to build a trusting relationship with someone. In terms of things that we can do to help, I suppose on a very basic level, it would be around being pleasant and smiling when you see somebody in that situation, and being kind and offering a few words of encouragement or saying hello. You can link in with an organisation like Cyrenians. If you see someone that you're concerned about, you can report to us through our social media, through our website, through our telephone number, and we'll send a team out to try and speak to that person and see if we can help them move away from homelessness.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Mike. And it's just great to hear the work that Cyrenians is doing in this area, and certainly something that I'm sure we'd want to support So yeah, thank you so much for speaking to us and taking your time to address some of these questions that our S1s had on the topic. I'm sure they'll take a lot of what you said to heart, and it really helps us fill that picture of what homelessness is like in Scotland, particularly today. So thanks, Mike. Appreciate that.
Thank you very much for your interest, and those were some wonderful questions. They showed some real sophistication of thought. Thank you.
Grand. Thanks so much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
We could not do what we do without our supporters. With 87p in every pound spent directly on frontline work, our supporters have helped change the lives of thousands of people across Scotland, helping to build more resilient communities.